For decades, the official story was simple. On August 16, 1977, the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, died of a heart attack at 42. The world mourned a tragic sudden end. But the truth of his final moments was sealed away in an autopsy report, locked in silence by authorities and guarded by a grieving family. Now, those vaults have been cracked open, and the documents reveal a story not of a single, fatal moment, but of a long, silent unravelling. A tale of medical neglect, suppressed conditions, and choices that paint a haunting portrait of the king's last days. This is not just the story of how Elvis died. It's the story of why the real cause was hidden from the world for nearly 50 years. Before we dive into the storm of secrets and lies, if you're ready for a history lesson they never wanted you to hear, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Imani Tunes. It's the only way you'll get every shocking update as this story unfolds. The world heard the news on a muggy August afternoon. Elvis Presley was dead. The official word, delivered by a choked-up press secretary on the Graceland driveway, was heart failure. It was a term vague enough to imply a natural, tragic end for a man whose body had simply given out. The globe went into immediate, profound mourning. Fans by the tens of thousands descended on the gates of Graceland, creating a spontaneous, tear-soaked vigil. The image was cemented. The king, struck down in his prime, a victim of perhaps exhaustion, perhaps the unbearable weight of his own crown. It was a clean, if devastating, end to the story. A legend needed a noble fall. But almost as swiftly as the grief spread, a quiet, persistent whisper began. It started in the back rooms of Memphis, in the hushed conversations of ambulance drivers and hospital orderlies. Rumours swirled of a scene that didn't add up to a simple heart attack. Whispers of pill bottles, of a body that told a different story. The most powerful catalyst for this doubt wasn't a rumour, however. It was an act of silence. The autopsy report, the one document that could confirm or deny the official story, was immediately sealed by order of the state. Not just sealed, but placed under a veil of such secrecy that it seemed to vanish from the earth. This wasn't standard procedure. This was a lock and key on history. That act, more than anything, cast the long, dark shadow of conspiracy over Graceland. It shouted that there was something to hide. To understand the final night, you must feel the eerie stillness that preceded it. Graceland, on August 15, 1977, was a mansion under a spell of oppressive quiet. Elvis was home, exhausted from a recent touring cycle, his health fragile. He was a man battling myriad private demons, chronic pain, devastating insomnia, the soul-crushing pressure of being Elvis every single moment. His body was a battleground, and the war was not going well. That evening he planned to fly out for another series of concerts. He spent time with his fiancée, Ginger Alden, and retired to his master bathroom to read. The house was calm, but this calm was a fragile illusion, the stillness before a storm that had been brewing for years. In the early afternoon of the 16th, that stillness was shattered. Ginger Alden awoke to find him unresponsive. The frantic calls began, first to his personal doctor, then to the paramedics. The scene in the bathroom shifted from a private sanctuary to a chaotic, desperate triage zone. Attempts to revive him were frenzied but futile. Soon the wail of sirens pierced the Graceland air, a sound never meant for the king's home. Paramedics rushed in with their equipment, a grotesque invasion of the inner sanctum. The surreal, heartbreaking sight of Elvis Presley, the icon of virility and energy, being carried down the front steps on a stretcher, under the blinding Memphis sun, marked the end of one era and the violent birth of another. The truth, or the first draft of it, was to be written in the cold, fluorescent light of the autopsy room at Baptist Memorial Hospital. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that went beyond medical solemnity. This was a historical examination, and everyone in the room knew it. As the pathologists began their work, a different presence was felt. Observers, men in sombre suits, officials whose allegiance was to the state and the preservation of order watched closely. They were not medical professionals. They were narrative managers. Almost immediately, initial findings sparked muted professional alarm. the state of the body, the condition of vital organs, the chemical signatures beginning to emerge from tissue samples, they pointed not to a simple cardiac event, but to a complex toxicology. The word polypharmacy was murmured. The presence of multiple potent substances was evident, but these medical whispers were quickly stifled. The unwelcome observers ensured the official channel remained quiet. The final, and perhaps most devastating act of that day was not performed with a scalpel, but with a pen. Elvis's father, the grief-stricken Vernon Presley, was presented with documents. In his state of shock and profound sorrow, and under immense pressure from authorities and advisers who spoke of protecting Elvis's legacy and avoiding scandal, Vernon signed. He agreed to seal the full autopsy report. In that signature, he surrendered the concrete truth of his son's suffering to a state-mandated silence. The king's body was no longer his own. His story was now property of the myth. With the truth officially buried, the conspiracy was born in the fertile ground of Memphis gossip. It flourished in the shadows. Bartenders downtown would share hushed tales overheard from off-duty cops. Nurses from the hospital traded fragments of forbidden knowledge on their breaks. The local lore became an underground tapestry of what really happened. Inside Graceland's walls, the silence was haunted. A young Lisa Marie Presley grew up in a home where the central tragedy was a subject you could not truly discuss, a wound covered by an official bandage. Priscilla Presley, though maintaining a poised public front, harboured deep and lingering doubts about the sanitized version of events. The press, initially hungry for the story, found themselves intimidated. Reporters pursuing leads were threatened with lawsuits, or worse, their careers put in jeopardy. Promising biographers found critical sources suddenly going silent, their memories failing. The vacuum of official truth became filled with ever more elaborate legends. Theories evolved from plausible ones, a catastrophic drug interaction, gross medical negligence by his personal doctors, to the fantastical, that he faked his death to escape fame, that he was a witness protected by the government, that he was simply hiding in plain sight. The Elvis is alive industry wasn't just a joke. It was a direct symptom of the sealed report. When you hide the truth, you invite the world to imagine something far wilder. The dam of silence held for decades, a monument to managed grief. But no vault, no matter how well constructed, is truly permanent. The first major crack appeared not with a bang, but with a slow legal drip. Persistent pressure from dedicated journalists and a faction of historians, armed with new freedom of information appeals, began to wear down the old walls. Then came the monumental announcement. A court order, citing historical significance and the public's right to know, had mandated the unsealing of the full, unredacted autopsy report and its associated investigative files. The media frenzy was instantaneous. Headlines worldwide screamed the impending revelation. It felt less like a news cycle and more like the reopening of a cold case that the entire planet had a stake in. The world held its breath, waiting for the document that promised to rewrite the final chapter of the 20th century's most iconic life. What the documents revealed was not a single, shocking cause of death, but a devastating chronicle of systemic failure. The official story of a sudden heart attack was obliterated. In its place was a detailed clinical portrait of a body in long-term, catastrophic decline. The report described a colon impacted and distended to a horrifying degree, a condition causing immense, chronic pain that had gone untreated for years. His liver showed significant damage, a clear sign of long-term substance abuse. His heart was weakened and enlarged, but it was merely one failing system among many. Most damning were the toxicology reports. They listed a dizzying cocktail of prescription pharmaceuticals in his bloodstream, opiates, sedatives, stimulants, in combinations and quantities that were described by independent experts as lethal synergy. This wasn't an overdose in the classic sense of a single night of excess. It was the culmination of a sustained, medically sanctioned poisoning. The narrative shifted from he died of a heart condition to he was killed by neglect, enabled by a circle of caretakers more interested in keeping the star performing than in saving the man. The cover-up, it became clear, was not just to hide a scandal, but to protect the very system that created it: the doctors, the handlers, the infrastructure of fame that required Elvis Presley to be a functioning product until the moment he could not function at all. For the Presley family, particularly Lisa Marie and Priscilla, the unsealing was not vindication. It was a second funeral, far more painful than the first. The raw clinical details forced them to confront a betrayal they had long suspected but could never prove. The report was a map of their loved one's suffering, laid bare in cold medical terminology. Lisa Marie spoke of the profound heartbreak of realizing how deeply her father had been failed by those entrusted with his care, and how the official silence had stolen from her the opportunity to understand and grieve his true struggle. Priscilla's quiet doubt was transformed into a quiet rage, the confirmation that the man she had loved was, in effect, allowed to die by a culture of yes-men and enablers, his cries for help medicalized into prescriptions. Their private grief now had a public, documented backbone. The legend of the clean, tragic death was gone, replaced by a messier, more human, and infinitely more agonizing truth. The global reaction was a tidal wave of transformed grief. For millions of fans, the initial shock of 1977 was refelt, but now tinged with a potent sense of anger. The vigil sites, once places of somber remembrance, became grounds for protest. Flowers were now accompanied by signs asking, "Who silenced the truth?" and "Justice for the King." The public outrage was directed not at a vague fate, but at specific named individuals: the Memphis Mafia of handlers, the complicit doctors, and the shadowy officials who had sealed the records. Fans felt they had been lied to for a lifetime, their genuine mourning built upon a false foundation. The conspiracy theories didn't die, they mutated. Now the question wasn't "is he alive?" but "who killed him?" and "who helped cover it up?" The conversation shifted from fantasy to accountability. The myth of the sudden noble fall was completely incinerated in the light of this new evidence, revealing the slow, painful, and entirely preventable crumble that had actually occurred. But as the dust from the revelation begins to settle, a more complex picture must be formed. We are left to reconcile the shocking, sordid truth of his death with the undeniable, earth-shaking legacy of his life and music. The man who died in that bathroom, frail and over-medicated, is the same man who, with a sway of his hip and a curl of his lip, changed the course of culture forever. One truth does not erase the other. The meaning of the 50-year silence is now painfully clear. It was a silence bought to protect interests, the financial interests of his estate, the professional interests of his doctors, the reputational interests of the city, and institutions involved. It was enacted to preserve a marketable image of the king, untarnished by the ugly realities of addiction and medical malpractice. It was a final act of legend management, an attempt to control the narrative of a life that had always spiraled beyond control. And now, with the vaults cracked open and the documents speaking their clinical, brutal truth, we see Elvis Presley not as a mythic king struck down by fate, but as a profoundly flawed, deeply suffering, and failed human being. He was a patient who was not healed, a star who was not protected, a man who was, in the end, tragically alone in his fortress. The mystery that fed legends for half a century is gone. In its place is a tragedy, stark and unadorned. Elvis Presley, at long last, can rest not in mystery but in truth. A painful, complicated truth, but truth nonetheless. And it is only in truth, however harsh, that any real peace can ever be found. So, what does this mean for the legend of the king? Does this brutal clinical truth diminish the icon? In many ways, it does the opposite. It completes him. For decades, Elvis Presley existed in two extremes: the untouchable, hip-shaking god of rock and roll, and the bloated, caricatured punchline of his final Vegas years. The sealed report allowed for that split, that comfortable disconnect. We could celebrate the young rebel without having to fully confront the broken man he became. But a person is not a collection of highlights or a catalogue of tragedies. A person is a continuum. The young truck driver who walked into Sun Studios with nothing but a sound in his head is the direct ancestor of the man who died in agony, seeking relief in a toxic cocktail. They are the same story. To ignore the end is to disrespect the journey. By locking away the autopsy, the authorities tried to freeze Elvis in a single acceptable moment, the tragic hero. But life is not a frozen moment. It is a motion, a struggle, a decay. In finally revealing the horrific physical cost of his fame, his pain, and his neglect, we are not destroying Elvis Presley. We are finally meeting him. All of him. The genius, the vulnerability, the self-destruction, the humanity. The legend is now a man, and a man, with all his flaws and failures, is always more compelling, more real, and more worthy of our honest remembrance than a legend ever could be. The music hasn't changed. Hound Dog still rocks. Suspicious Minds still aches. But now we listen with new ears, ears that understand the immense crushing weight of the crown that produced it. The king is dead. Long live the man.